Good afternoon. My name is Michael Pollack, CEO of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, also known as DBSA. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our first Facebook Live event. Anya Vokapol lived with both a mood disorder and a substance use disorder. Sadly, in June, at only the age of 36, she passed away. Anya's family and friends contributed generously to DBSA in her memory. Recognizing those living with this type of dual diagnosis, having unique needs, these funds that have been raised will be used to launch a new DBSA support group specifically for individuals in similar situations. This includes today's education event, which is open to peers, family and friends, and clinicians. So to help raise awareness for our upcoming support group, we've chosen to hold today's event on Facebook. And while we will consider other platforms in the future, we chose Facebook as this first-time event platform, given that most of our community seems to be engaged in this venue. So it is my pleasure today to serve as your moderator and to introduce you to our presenters. First, we have Dr. Greg Simon. Dr. Simon currently serves as the Senior Investigator at Health Cooperative Center for Health Studies in the Pacific Northwest, and he holds an appointment as a research professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington. Dr. Simon also practices adult psychiatry and group behavioral health service. His research is focused on improving care for people with mood disorders. Specific research areas include epidemiology of mental disorders, management of depression in primary care, cost effectiveness of psychiatric treatments, and psychosocial treatments for depression and bipolar. Dr. Simon serves on DBSA's Scientific Advisory Board, and he's also on the editorial boards of the Psychological Medicine, General Hospital Psychiatry, and Current Opinion in Psychiatry. He has authored or co-authored approximately 150 scientific publications. Most of them are related to mood disorders. Dr. Simon, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Our other I have to remember to unmute myself. We'll be doing that over and over again today. I'm just doing a sound check as well. How's my sound? Can you all hear me okay?
We can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Our second presenter that you'll hear from this hour is Kimberly Allen. Kimberly is a national behavioral healthcare business consultant, licensed chemical dependency counselor, and past treatment administrator who shares treatment education and insight with various behavioral health systems. Kimberly served on multiple business, learning, collaborative, and academic advisory councils around mental health, addiction, recovery, and fighting stigma in the mental health and LGBTQ community. Current collaborative relationships include serving as a member of DBSA's Transforming the Definition of Wellness Patient Advisory Council. She's a member of the Use of Proceeds Group and Lived Experience Council with the Healthy Brain Global Initiative, and a stability leader with the Stability Network. Kimberly is also a peer who lives with a mood disorder and a substance use disorder. Kimberly, we're so glad that you're able to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
For those of you participating in today's event, we want to invite you to ask Dr. Simon and or Kimberly your questions about living with a dual diagnosis of a mood disorder and a substance use disorder. You can do so by entering your question in the chat box. And I will be checking that chat box regularly and making sure that your questions are answered as best as we can within the hour we have available this afternoon. But to get started, I'm going to ask the first couple of questions. First, Dr. Simon, this is for you. Could you just start by defining what is a dual diagnosis?
Yeah, well, that term is, I think, most often used to refer to the experience of living with a mood disorder or another, we would say mental health or psychiatric disorder, as well as a substance use disorder. Although I actually think it's important to point out, and this is something that DBSA constituents and people with mood disorders will understand, that it's often maybe a triple diagnosis. That we know that the overlap of mood disorders and mental health conditions, substance use conditions, and medical conditions, often, and that substance use disorders affect people's physical health, mood disorders affect people's physical health. So this experience of, to use a term people use now, intersectionality, or people living with these multiple different experiences that affects their health that all interact with each other.
Thank you. Kimberly, beyond the clinical definition, certainly this is a condition that can be treated, but also impacts real people, including people perhaps participating today or their family members. And certainly you've had your own personal journey. I'm wondering, to the degree you're comfortable, could you share a little bit about your story and your experience?
Sure, Michael, I'm happy to do that. And it's my pleasure to be with you with DBSA. I'm certainly with Dr. Greg Simon, whom I've looked up to for years. To those of you in the audience, yes, I live with a substance use disorder. My diagnosis is bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. In a nutshell, when I was preparing for this and I was looking back on my life, even I am a little bit overwhelmed in looking at it. One thing I can tell you to place it in history, my story largely started when my father's story started. My dad was a physician that was drafted to the war in Vietnam, and his war started when he landed in Vietnam. Mine started when he returned home to the United States. I was only about 6 years old, but what I mean by that is my father was a very serious drinking alcoholic person and had not been prior to that time. He was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Certainly I became that in a vicarious fashion. That means from listening, from seeing things along those lines, and he was bipolar and alcohol. So, growing up with my dad, I can't tell you how much I loved him, respected him, brilliant physician. However, it drove the course of my life. Well into high school, I drank a fair amount. I watched him drink a fair amount. Certainly I don't hold him responsible for that, but I will say, as a kid, I got friendliest girl in high school. I worked at a water ski exhibition organization. I was very popular, and I drank and I smoked marijuana. I went off to school as expected. I got in a sorority as expected. My whole life was rather exclusive and not inclusive, and I think that has a whole lot to do with what drove my behavior. At that time, I did ultimately become aware that I'm gay. I'm a lesbian person. So I had a stranglehold of silence, a stranglehold of stigma, and that really drove my behavior, although at that time, I couldn't have told you that. My father tragically died at the age of 57. I will say that before his organs shut down from alcoholism, and so tragically so, and before he got alcohol-related dementia, as they called it back in the day, he said to me, Kimberly, be sure that you tell people I did not die of alcoholism, I died from the stigma. Then he went into a coma. Those words have rung in my mind for the rest of my life, and it has driven so much of me. I remember the kindness of a VA nurse that stopped by with a dozen roses and set him at the end of his bed and looked at me directly and said, your father also has shell shock. Those were very new words, post-Vietnam shell shock. We now call that PTSD. Certainly I had that from, watching him envision the Viet Cong surrounding our house, taking guns out of his hands, things like that. So, as a young adult, I had a lot on my mind. I did go on to be successful, but I tell you what, despite earning a couple of degrees, I worked at the largest ad agency in the world. It was that stranglehold of silence, my own anxiety and depression that caused me to elect to get sober amazingly when I was 26 years old. You know, back in the day, a lot of people didn't do that. The reason I say that is that's just terror. When you watch someone turn yellow and die that way, I would say I was driven by the lash of fear that Alcoholics Anonymous so clearly describes. But here's what I did right. I kept on attending. I kept on going to those meetings because that's what we had available. And I look back on that. I accessed every possible healthcare avenue that I could. In public health, I went and got information, thankfully, but my life was very compartmentalized. You know, my mental health condition went undiagnosed for 10 years. And do you know that average still stands? 10 years I waited that diagnosis. So those 10 years of my sobriety in my young life from 26 to 36, I cannot tell you that I enjoyed myself. I can only tell you that I just suited up and showed up and I kept working. You know, I will say that I swam every day. I rode my bike every day and I went to therapy. And thankfully, there are well-intended clinicians out there that tried to help me stay contained, to learn communication skills, and to cope with some of these other behaviors that I had that were really so difficult. So I did get diagnosed bipolar and PTSD about 10 years later. Very grateful for that. Very grateful.
Thank you, Kimberly, and what a journey you've been on. And I'm so glad that you're in such a good place right now. Dr. Simon, I know everyone's experience is unique, and their own journey is not going to be the same as someone else's. But could you speak to how common or widespread is it for someone to be experiencing a mental health condition and a substance use disorder?
Well, you know, we know that, you know, there is a huge overlap between mental health conditions and substance use problems and at a higher level substance use disorder. We know that having a mood disorder makes people more likely to have problems with alcohol or other substances. Having problems with alcohol or other substances makes it more likely for people to develop a mood disorder. I think finally we've moved past the debates. You know, there were certainly debates in the past about, is it that mood disorders cause substance use problems or substance use problems cause mood disorders? And the answer is yes. It's obviously both. That street runs in both directions. Depending on what population we look in, for instance, if we look at veterans or people with military experience, we often find even higher overlap. We might see there as many as, you know, half of people who have a mood disorder also have substance use problems. So that common experience is more the norm than the exception, I would say.
Kimberly, you talked a little bit about, you started to touch on different elements of your treatment, but could you expound further on which paths of treatment have been most effective for your own recovery?
That's such an important question. Thank you for that question. Yes, you know what I see in current day, Michael, that makes such a difference? You know, back in the day, we just, we complied with care. In other words, you know, if a physician came forward and said, Kimberly, you have bipolar disorder and this is what you're going to do, we complied with care. And I'm not saying that back then I didn't need to. Like I said, this was well intended and I did comply. And medication has been helpful to me, and I still elect to take medication. But this is what's so great about today. Now we have collaborative care. And I've got a great relationship with my therapist, a great relationship with my psychiatrist. You know, we collaborate on what my path is. So my path includes boxing, swimming, psychiatric healthcare, therapy. So it's that collective conversation along with support groups that drive care forward today. It's a very welcoming aspect for me.
Dr. Simon, just for individuals who may not be familiar with the term collaborative care, could you talk a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, we use that term to describe sort of effective interdisciplinary collaboration. And I think fortunately the world of mental health clinicians, of clinicians who treat substance use disorders, and general medical clinicians, primary care doctors, now recognize the importance of that constant communication, collaboration, and integrated or organized care. There still have been, there were times in the past, when there were these silos, when things were completely separate, when providers did not speak with each other, care was fragmented and much less effective. The research evidence for the effectiveness of more integrated care is very, very strong. We still see, unfortunately, in Washington State, for instance, where I practice, we still have, I think, some fairly antiquated laws about the separation of records and separation of other things that get in the way of collaborative care. But we're making progress.
We have a question in the chat room, the chat box rather. And before I read it, I just want to remind those of you listening and watching, please send your questions to us through the chat box for Dr. Simon and for Kimberly. Dr. Simon, I'm going to ask you to respond to this question first, and then Kimberly, perhaps just from personal experience, if you'd like. How do I stop cycling through different substances while living with a mood disorder?
Yeah, and I think what the question describes sort of a common experience that for many people who live with a mood disorder, their experience with substance use disorder, substance problems may actually involve alcohol, a variety of other substances at different times in life. I think we know now that recovery from mood disorders and from substance use disorders is often a long-term process where what we hope to do is to learn from experience, to not, have too much guilt or blame about slips or relapses. We can say that more effective management of mood symptoms does reduce the likelihood that people will relapse and increase the likelihood of recovery. And similarly, effective care for substance use disorders reduces mood symptoms. So I guess if the bad news is that substance use and mood disorders can reinforce each other on the way up, the good news is that they can also sort of reinforce each other on the way down. That recovery on one count helps with recovery on other counts. Now, what exactly contributes to recovery is specific to individuals. If we talk about recovery from substance use disorders, we know that there are some common principles, but the exact path is going to vary from person to person. Similarly, for effective treatment for mood disorders, although we might say effective treatment most often involves a combination of counseling or psychotherapy and medication, the specific kind of counseling or the specific medication that's something that each person really has to discover.
Kimberly, I'm just wanting to see from your perspective, your own experience stopping the cycle.
Yeah, I really, really like what the doctor just said, and I tell you that is my experience. Like I said, alcohol was a big problem for me. It was readily attainable and it was socially acceptable. Even for me at that time. So here's what I did. I stopped drinking for 10 years, but I didn't feel good at all. And I was candid. When I think about collaborative care, I remember coming forward, calling my doctor, calling my psychiatrist, and saying, "Sir, I just smoked some marijuana. I need for you to know that, and I'm not sure what to do." I felt really frightened that night. I was having a very hard time managing my own anxiety and fear, and I was by myself. So that's kind of what I mean about collaboration. It was an easy does it situation. I remember my doctor really getting to know me through my candor and saying to me, "You know what? We are not going to overreact to this situation, Kimberly. I'm aware that you're in recovery and we're going to work through this." And I made a personal decision to not keep smoking marijuana. Part of it is that I didn't want to smoke anything. I got cancer of the thyroid as one example. The doctor just talked about that. So I made those decisions jointly, no pun intended, with my doctor as I went down the path. And just like Dr. Simon said, no penalty there. Just be transparent and candid and allow those supporting me to work through it with me and not go into the penalty box and take my own stripes off my shoulders and shame. That's the part, self-stigma and shame. I just don't believe in it because it doesn't help. So I would try to get rid of that. Don't buy into the stigma and the self-shame is what I mean. Just be candid.
Yeah. Thank you, Kimberly. Dr. Simon, we have another comment from one of our viewers who asks, quite frankly, the question is, what do I do if I feel like I can't win?
Yeah. Well, I'd say that although some people may think it's a tired old saying, one day at a time. Even if you're not yourself participating in a 12-step program, that's one lesson from 12-step programs that I think is helpful and applies both to recovery from substance use problems and living more effectively or recovery from a mood disorder. When it comes to substance use problems, we're talking about staying clean or staying sober one day at a time. When we talk about mood disorders, we're talking about what are the small, specific, positive things that people can do one day at a time. The things that we know help for people who live with mood disorders. Keeping to a regular sleeping schedule. Trying to get some regular physical activity. Trying to have some positive social contact, ideally early in the day, that can set the scheme for the day about how you feel. It may seem sort of tiresome to have to do those things over and over again day after day, but they do matter. They do make a difference.
Could you elaborate further, Dr. Simon, on the distinctions in treatment for someone with a substance use disorder? You talked about 12-step, and for someone with a mood disorder. Can you say a little more about how they're similar and where they're indeed distinct or separate?
Well, I think there, when we think about the key steps in recovery, there are a lot of common elements. If you want to use the terms that sort of, therapists or psychiatrists or clinicians might use, they talk about cognitive and behavior therapy. Those may be terms familiar to many of our DBSA constituents or listeners. But what those are really about are dealing with the thought patterns that are unhealthy and developing more positive or healthy daily behavior patterns that reinforce wellness. And those things are common to living with a mood disorder, recovery from mood disorder, and recovery from substance use disorders. In terms of dealing with the thought patterns that tend to lead to relapse, the thought patterns that tend to lead to depression, and those daily activity patterns, the basic things we talked about, the keeping to a regular sleep schedule, physical activity, making sure to have positive social contact. Those things really do matter.
One of the questions from our chat box speaks to another element of somebody's wellness journey, and that would be support groups. Dr. Simon, I'll start with you. The question is, how can a dual diagnosis or a mood and substance use support group work for someone?
Well, I'm a firm believer in peer support. DBSA's tagline, "We've been there, we can help." It is that shared experience and people who've been through that and understand. So for people who've lived both with a mood disorder and a substance use disorder, being able to connect with, get support from, and learn from other people who have that intersectionality, that shared experience is really important. I think it's also important for people who live with a substance use disorder and a mood disorder, that if they're in a peer support group, that it supports all aspects of their recovery. For some people, taking medication for management of mood symptoms is really central to recovery. And it's not a good idea if you're in a support group that frowns on that or thinks that that's forbidden.
Kimberly, from your own experience with support groups, how can a dual diagnosis support group work for others?
I smiled a little bit when Dr. Simon was talking, because I learned this the hard way, speaking honestly. Because I started taking medication so long ago, it wasn't really something that people talked about. So I went into a room with people that did not necessarily support that by any means, and it put me under a lot of pressure. Part of what and I did it anyway. When you talk about a hope, let me tell you, like I said, the stranglehold of silence, I pried that off of my own throat, by talking about it anyway, as long as I felt strong enough and supported enough to do so. Now, in current day, we do have groups that are dual diagnosis groups, and what a pleasure. When I first started doing that, I cried immediately when I walked in because there was no more compartmentalization on my end. I didn't have to keep my life separate like this. That's what's hard for me. I wanted to be integrated, and I wanted my identity to be candid and honest. You keep hearing me say those words. It's not that I was dishonest prior, but I wanted to be in a safe environment. And guess what? DBSA has offered me that. It's very liberating to be in these environments and to talk about that and just be myself in all the ways that I just named. Not silent.
Kimberly, we have another question. This one is specifically for you. Again, it's in the chat box. Thank you for those that are submitting questions. Encourage others to continue to do so. Kimberly, the question is, as a person with a lived experience, actually, and Dr. Simon, also for you as a clinician, how do you see faith and spirituality playing a part in people's lives? And Kimberly, why don't we start with you this time?
What an amazing question. What a gifted, beautiful question. Around my neck, I don't know if you can see this. These are objects that were given to me. This happens to be a rosary, but it was given to me, by a young person that was really struggling. And a lot of times I'll hold this in my hand. I'm thinking of her. I'm thinking of me. So for a long time, I didn't understand the difference between kind of the dogma, so to speak, of religion that didn't work as well for me every day, but rather the spirit of what lives and breathes in the world. So, I find it in people, definitely. I look in the eyes of my dog on the days I don't believe in anything, and I see her spirit there. It's really phenomenal. This sounds sort of silly, but go ahead and look up what elephants do when an elephant dies. They circle around this elephant, and they seem to be communicating with each other. I believe in all things spiritual. So you know what I love about being in recovery? All spiritual things play a role. So yes, I do have a spiritual life in it, and it changes all the time. So we welcome these things in current day recovery. That's my opinion, and that is my experience.
Thanks, Kimberly. Dr. Simon, as a scientist, how do you see faith and spirituality?
Well, I think that connection and hope are absolutely central to recovery. They're absolutely essential to recovery from substance use disorders and mood disorders. Different people will find that connection and that hope in different places. Certainly, the science is there. If we say that, participating in a faith community, a community of people to whom you are connected, that is a positive influence on mental and physical health. That much is very clear. That spiritual practice contributes to recovery. I think that has good, strong scientific support. I think, as one of the questions in the chat box points out, there is, though, a lot of variety and diversity in how people find that connection and where they find it in the spiritual practices that are helpful to them. And that is a sort of lifelong challenge. I'll put in a little pitch here. Some of you may know Marsha Linehan, who's a psychologist who developed dialectical behavior therapy. Her autobiography, which is called Building a Life Worth Living, is a really incredibly insightful description of her own recovery journey and spiritual journey and how those two connected together. I thought it was a great book.
All right. A good reference for our audience. Thank you. Dr. Simon, I'm going to pose this next question to you. The question reads, I try and be supportive to a partner who suffers from a dual diagnosis and wondered what are good or bad things I should and should not do. And Kimberly, I'm going to ask you to also answer that question afterward.
Yeah. Well, I think that for someone who lives with someone who has a mood disorder or lives with a substance use disorder, this can be a really challenging experience, especially if you see people relapse back into substance use, if you see people have severe mood episodes. I think actually the science does tell us some things about what are helpful. Critical communication, or communication that's perceived as critical. You could think of it as sort of hot communication, the kind of things that people might say in the heat of the moment, I think are often not helpful. The idea of a sort of a confrontational intervention, I would say, may work well on afternoon television shows, but it doesn't work too well in real life. Certainly, offering ongoing support is very important. Speaking honestly and saying what you see, but saying that in a supportive, non-confrontational way. How that would apply, for instance, to people living with a mood disorder, as opposed to saying, I think you're manic. Have you been taking your medicine? Might be more helpful to say, I notice that you've been getting up really early in the morning, and I notice that you seem really speeded up. At times in the past when those things happen, that sometimes led to problems. What do you think? So that sort of rhythm of saying, here's what I notice, here's what I'm concerned about, what do you think about that, is probably a better way to bring up some of those challenging topics.
So I learned a new term, hot communication, and I'm gonna remember that as something not to participate in. But Kimberly, as somebody who's been on this journey for quite a long time, what is your answer to our peers' question here?
That is such a good question. You heard this story about my father, and so I know that I could not change his path. I know that, this was proof, this was evidence, that no one can control another person. But I'm going to agree once again with the doctor. You can see how science and spirit and recovery work together. I'm in a 25-year partnership, and I tell you one thing that we did, and I'm so glad we did this. We worked on communication. This was at the end of the single most devastating impact of my mania. My behavior was not good. I did not want to quit my job. I did not want to quit the behaviors I was engaging in. I was a handful, to say the very least. And some very well-intentioned clinicians really did what I would call an intervention on me. Didn't work. Absolutely didn't work. I fled the scene. I was not up for that. So I will never forget when I met this psychologist, and he sat me down. And he read out of the DSM. In other words, he read me my diagnosis and he closed it. He said, do you agree to this bipolar diagnosis? And I said, well, yes, I found that to be a bit boring. And he closed it. And then he came and he gave me a little wooden Buddha like this. And he said, you hold this and you listen. And then your partner will talk. She holds it and she listens. And that's how we started off. We started off engaged and active listening. And I want you to, and we read book after book on this topic. And I want you to know that it has worked beautifully. We have an agreement between us. And sometimes I'll invite that. I'll say, what do you think? How do you feel that I'm doing right now? There have been times I've invited my partner to join me in my psychiatric counsel. Why? To keep the communication ongoing, to keep everything in the forefront. That does not feel invasive to me. That's at my own invitation, off and on. But I particularly like it, what Dr. Simon said. Anyone really is free to say to me, do you mind if I talk with you for a moment? Here's something that I remember I had 40 employees, and they came to me and they said, Kimberly, we would like to tell you you're drinking too many Diet Cokes and we're not into it. We don't want to talk to you in the early morning. What do you think I did? I took up Topo Chico. I listened to that collective voice, and I went ahead on and did as they asked me to do. I appreciated it.
Kimberly, I'm going to pose our next question that came from the chat box to you. What can family members say to a loved one who refuses to acknowledge their diagnosed bipolar and substance use and consistently lean on you to solve their problems?
Boy, I tell you what, first of all, thank you for the question. I experienced this myself with family members. My phone rings off the wall. Sometimes people say they want help, but they want me, Kimberly Allen, to solve it. And I'm not talking about my clinical, I'm talking about my peer life. So here's what I do. I always keep a list of resources, and I push those across the desk where I say to them, look, nowadays we have virtual support groups. DBSA has those groups. We've got we have peers like me, people that stand in the gap and come forward and say, look, just like Dr. Simon said, I am a peer. I'm a certified peer. I'm trained to visit with you and to listen to you and to stand in the gap. Or you can give something in writing. But whatever you do, I just gave my number to someone the other day, and I said, tell you what, let me offer you this. From this point forward, we're standing right here as peers, and I give the person resources and say, do you know what? This is your right. This is your right to make this decision. And here's the opportunity. And I continue to parrot that. Here's the opportunity. Here's your ticket, as I see it, to freedom from bondage of self, as we say. Did that help?
I hope so. Dr. Simon, anything you would add that a family member can say?
Yeah, well, I think that emphasis on speaking, honestly, kindly, and specifically, and non-diagnostically. And I have to say, even not as a family member, as a doctor, I actually rarely find it helpful to throw diagnoses at people. What's more helpful, I find, is to say, here's some things I noticed that it seems like might be bothering you. How could we help you with those things? Or here's some things I noticed that are concerning to me. Are they concerning to you?
We have another question from our viewers. It reads, I currently go for maintenance ECT every other week and take multiple medications, but I'm still struggling. Do you have any alternative suggestions to help deal with my psychosis and mood swings? Dr. Simon, I'm going to pose that one to you.
Yeah. Well, I certainly couldn't give you specific advice about medications or even about ECT treatments, because that's very, very specific to each person, and I certainly hope that you have, clinicians you can trust who are giving you advice about that. But yeah, in general, I'd say, when you're getting sort of medical treatment, which might include medications or ECT, what kind of things can happen or should happen alongside that can be helpful? Because wellness is a lot of things. Wellness often involves for people who live with mood disorders, it involves a real focus on your daily rhythm and daily routine, the regular sleeping and waking schedule, regular physical activity. Making sure that those things that are meaningful and give you purpose in life, that there is a place and time for them in each day. Even when you don't feel like it, they can really make a difference. Getting sort of counseling or therapy where you're meeting with a professional therapist can often be helpful. And of course, I have to mention peer support. Whether you have peer support groups these days, you may only be able to meet with online. But someday we'll be back in the place where we can have in-person support group meetings, and I think those are probably the best way to go once that's possible again.
Thank you. Our next question, Kimberly, I'm going to ask you if you would like to take a stab at this. How to reach a young adult who denies substance use? How to help them see the need for dual treatment to, quote, manage their bipolar condition?
Mm-hmm. I work within this every day. I primarily as a peer, and I don't use my license typically. I work as a peer almost all the time, and this comes up a lot. Are you utilizing substances? The answer is no. Or I may say, how often are you drinking or smoking or something to that effect? And they'll say 3 beers per day or something like that. Typically, that indicates more like 6. It's not that people are intentionally being dishonest with me, but it's a tough revelation. Here's how I do it. Number one, I ask them how they're feeling. How are you feeling? Do you know, to this day, that's very compelling to me, versus my behavior. How are you feeling right now? And it's what Dr. Simon talked about. Here's what your behavior indicates to me. here's what I'm observing about you. You know, you have slurred speech. You know, your memory is not as good. You're not acting like yourself. You're being disrespectful. This doesn't make sense. You know, I don't know you in this way. You know, this isn't your heart. You know, a lot of times when people talk to me about my heart or my soul, or, you know, when my behavior don't match my own ethics, you know, usually if someone would come forward, and I do this all the time, and say, how do you feel about your conduct? You know, is this something that you would like to change? I've noticed that people really seem to come around much faster and say, actually, yes, you know, I'm very lonely, I'm sad, I'm afraid. And then once again, I say, you know, there are peers available. You know, how might I help you to visit with them about this? Usually their disclosure with us is pretty rapid. That's been my experience, both as a counselor, as a peer, and as an individual in recovery, and as a treatment administrator. How do you feel? That question is a good one.
The one, you know, when you, I think we're reading into that question, you know, it may be someone saying, you know, a young person who's using substances who says, I don't think it's a problem. And, you know, my usual approach to that would be not to say, I know it is a problem, but to ask the question, how would we know if it's a problem? What would be the things that you and I might see together that would tell us this is a problem? I can and often do, you know, as a clinician or as a physician, speak about what we know about most people. You know, I could say to someone, you know, if you're using marijuana every day throughout the day, and you're somebody who lives with a mood disorder, for most people, that's not a good idea. For most people, that will make things worse. Now, I can't be 100% certain that for you it's making things worse, but how would we know? And often what that comes to is the way we would know is to stop using and see if you feel better. You have to be, you know, we want to make sure that people are open to that experience of saying, I should try and see if it makes my life better. But I found that how would we know approach often works better than the come down hard confrontation approach.
You know, our next question, I think, it piggybacks nicely off of what you just shared, and that is, could you explain the difference between self-medicating and addiction?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't tend to use either of those terms that often, just because they can mean so many different things to different people. But you know, let's dig into those words a little. So, you know, the word addiction too often to me carries some sort of, I don't know what to say about it except moral baggage that I would prefer to avoid. But, you know, what we mean in a medical sense, if you use the word addiction, is we mean someone is using substances at a level where they build up a tolerance to it. What we mean by tolerance is you're using more and more and it affects you less and less. Or they develop a dependence on it. What we mean by dependence is, and if you stop taking it, you have a withdrawal reaction. So that really is almost a physical medical thing that can happen with a wide variety of substances. The term self-medicating, I'm not sure it's that useful a term because it certainly many people may use substances to blunt or dull or reduce their awareness of symptoms of a mood disorder. Using the term self-medicating, though, carries with it some idea that that's actually effective or useful. Now, it is true, say, that, you know, alcohol is probably the oldest treatment in the world for mood symptoms, but it is also one of the least effective. So if you want to say, you know, is using alcohol by someone who has a mood disorder self-medicating, I guess if you'd say, are people often using alcohol to blunt or dull their awareness of mood symptoms? Yes. But is it effective or does it work? No.
Kimberly, anything you would add from your personal perspective?
I'm so glad you asked me because I think about this a lot. Here's how I talk to myself, and a lot of times what I say to people, there is no doubt in my mind that I misused substances. There is no doubt. I mean, anyone that knew me could have easily said, Kimberly, I've been misusing substances. Kimberly drank more than my dates in college. I mean, but here's what I didn't like: misuse or dependence. I don't like the idea of dependence. And I remember when this word evolved from addiction, and I ask young people this all the time when I visit with them, and people my age, I'm 61, how dependent are you? How dependent do you wish to be? Most people really don't like that idea. They would rather disengage from this dependency. People don't really like that in relationships necessarily, being overly dependent or misusing really any situation. So that's how I talk to myself. I use it on eating. I use it on everything. I don't want to misuse any one or anything. And I certainly don't want to be dependent. And I've noticed that people will quickly say, I don't want to be dependent on this drug myself. It's worked better for me.
Yeah. One of my own observations and takeaways from this conversation is the importance of language, which language we stay away from, which language is maybe more inviting or is less likely to put someone on the defensive. Could either one of you speak to maybe additional language that you would encourage people to use or to avoid using? Dr. Simon, can I start with you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I will confess I can sometimes maybe get too into this thing about language and meaning because I'm kind of a word nerd. I'll admit to being that. And also want to say, each individual I think has a right to be called and to use the names they want to use. That is their perfect right. So. For instance, if we talk about some of these issues, I am not fond of using the word alcoholic, and you will not usually see it come out of my mouth. If someone calls themselves that and uses that word for themselves, I don't argue with them. Although I might say, I won't use that term, but it's fine with me if you use it. If someone says, I am a bipolar, some people still say that. I'll say, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say you're a person who lives with bipolar disorder. That's the term that I would use, but I'm not going to say you can't use that name for yourself. But I think that, to me, it's important to use language that separates the person from a condition or problem they live with, that recognizes their personhood separate from that. To me, those issues are important.
Kimberly?
Yes, DBSA. You freed me in this way. I'm talking to I became an advocate with Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, and I remember they called and asked if I wanted to go to a training, and I just said yes. And that's my best advice: just say yes. And I went, and I remember learning those words. I live with a mental health condition. I say it all the time. And sometimes people want to know, and I will say I live with bipolar disorder. I live with anxiety. Not long ago, I had a hard time getting on an elevator. This was pre-COVID. And I think it almost broke everyone's heart watching me try to get on the elevator. I would put my foot in and back up and put my foot in and back up. And I thought, do you know what? I looked at these perfect strangers and I said, do you know what? I live with anxiety. I'm having an anxious moment right this minute. And their kindness toward me was absolutely overwhelming. Ultimately, I was able to get on. I remember this woman holding it saying, come on, get in with us, honey. You can do it. And I thought, you know what that is? I'm talking to myself. I live with these conditions. I'm not dying of these conditions. I'm living with these conditions. And that's what I tell myself all the time. And that really works for me, but that's just my story. Everybody's got their own.
We have a couple more questions in the chat box. The first is, how do I manage my dual diagnosis and seasonal seasonal affective disorder. Dr. Simon, could you take that?
Well, as I think most people know, the term seasonal affective disorder is most often used to talk about seasonal depression. And the most typical pattern of that is people who experience depression either never experience depression in the spring and summer and experience depression in the fall and winter, or sometimes more often people who have more severe depression in the fall and winter and not as severe depression in the spring and summer. There are, as you know, treatments more specific for seasonal depression, light therapy being the one that most people know about. But I would say the same thing as living with another kind of mood disorder and a substance use disorder, which is they certainly can interact with each other. That people who have a seasonal mood disorder are at higher risk for problems with alcohol and other substances. And certainly I would underline that alcohol, marijuana, other substances are not effective treatments for a seasonal mood disorder. And that all of the things that we've been saying, I think, about other mood disorders and substance disorders apply the same way to people who live with a seasonal mood disorder. So I guess my short answer is I don't think it's that different.
Thank you for the questions. Our next question, don't we have to address the underlying issues before we can address the reason for substance abuse? Isn't that left to a clinician?
I'm interested in Kimberly's thoughts, but I'll maybe take first crack at that one. I think we really need to get away from the either or thinking or the which one first thinking. And there were these traditional ideas about, for instance, not exactly this one, but another example would be, I trained in an era where people might even say things like, you can't even diagnose or treat depression until somebody has been sober for 3 months, some sort of artificial term. We've really moved away from that, and I think we now understand that addressing these kind of problems together, simultaneously, collaboratively, as Kimberly say, is way more effective than seeing them as separate things that we have to do first one and then the other. So I would say that getting effective treatment for a mood disorder that includes medication treatment and being in counseling or therapy to address some historical issues that may contribute to the mood disorder. It's not like you have to do one first and then the other. You can do both of those things at the same time. In the same way, being involved in treatment that addresses substance use and that addresses some historical issues, those are not, those don't have to be sequenced. It's not either or, it's both and, I think.
And Kimberly, we're going to give you the last word, just your own experience on addressing those underlying issues.
As I mentioned, I was a hardworking treatment administrator. I was flanked by counselors. I've worked as a peer in treatment. Those are great questions to ask if you need treatment. To come in and say, do you really do dual diagnosis and allow that unfolding? It's a privilege to watch people do this. We're working hard in healthcare today to make sure that we do this simultaneously. So, when I got sober, my issues roared to the surface. And like I said, I don't want anyone to have to go through that 10-year window, to wait for a solid diagnosis that saved my life, that helped me to save my life. So this is what dual diagnosis is all about. In other words, I'm going to agree with Dr. Simon. I totally believe in treatment settings that do both. And that's why I got certified as a peer in both mental health and substance use, because I'm a person in recovery for both. And I think that that's helped a lot of people. It's a privilege to watch people unfold across the board with both of these very serious conditions.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Dr. Simon. We really appreciate you both taking this hour to talk to our community about both mood disorders and substance use disorders. As I mentioned at the outset, this event is the precursor to our upcoming dual diagnosis virtual support group, which will be a weekly support group that'll start on Tuesday, November 10th. It'll occur every Tuesday at 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central Time. It is free. The lead facilitator is Melissa Morgan Tang, and you'll see there on the screen there. To sign up, just go to dbsalliance.org/talk dual diagnosis to sign up. I want to thank our viewers for participating in our session. I again want to thank Dr. Simon and Kimberly for your honesty, your perspective, and all of this great information that you shared to really make our community more informed and better equipped for themselves and those that they love. So with that, I wish everyone a good rest of their day. Stay safe and be well.
Okay.